Hi, I'm Tim, welcome to our channel, and thanks for logging on. Today we're going beach to tux with two late model, pre-owned, all-arounders for men. Rolex Datejust 116300 versus Grand Seiko Hi-Beat Automatic SBGH045. Let the games begin. Let's discuss the less familiar of these two watches. Grand Seiko, of course, a smaller volume brand making smaller volume models, isn't quite as prominent as Rolex, to put it mildly. Nevertheless, it has gained a rabid following due to the unique character as well as undoubted value proposition of the watches it offers. Now, this timepiece on my wrist is similar to the Datejust 2, but it's also distinct in several key respects: lines, mechanical specification, and case size. Titanium and 40 millimeters. You can see this watch features the great Grand Seiko 44GS polyhedron case form. The watch is 13.8 millimeters thick, and you can see that although it should duck under most cuffs, it may not work with the absolute tightest of dress sleeves, so that's a mark for the Rolex. You'll also note that the spacing between the lugs is a vintagey 19 millimeters, and there are two ways to measure this watch across the wrist. Now, my wrist, 16 centimeters in circumference. We'll zoom out a little bit. Ships this watch easily. Lug-to-lug, 46.5 millimeters, and if you include the solid end links of the bracelet, then the watch is 50 millimeters across the wrist. In titanium, it feels much lighter on the wrist than the 904L stainless steel Rolex, and the bracelet that's included probably owes at least one passing nod to the Rolex 3-link Oyster design, but Grand Seiko truly makes the classical 3-link bracelet its own. You can see there's minimal taper here, if any, but there is a handsome interplay of polished and satin finished elements. You'll also note that Grand Seiko still gives you strap tool apertures in the lugs if you wish to switch things up. There is a folding clasp, single deployant, and as you can see, it's actuated by triggers, so it's released by triggers rather than friction fit or locked with a clamshell system. Jumping over to the case, this is an element that Grand Seiko does as well as anyone in the business at any price. The polyhedron case form is both remarkable in its combination of curves and creases, its many facets, and its symmetry, and of course the black polish, or the Zaratsu machine polish known as Zaratsu at Grand Seiko, a tin plate pressed against the case, spinning at high RPM, guided by the hand, the eye, and the experience of an artisan. Each one of these polished facets is black polished, the same degree of finish you would see on, for example, the screws inside a Patek Philippe or a Geneva hallmark Vacheron Constantin. It is impressive to see hand-finished components on the scale of a watch case. But the splendor continues, as does the craft art on the dial side. Let's remove my fingerprints, and you'll note that the watch features a lovely dial that defies description. I'm going to do my best to catch it in the light here, but it is almost a dark burgundy or an oxblood red. Grand Seiko describes this dial as brown, but that's like saying that the Emerald City is green. Something is lost in the description. This watch has a depth and a luster, almost as though lacquer were laid down on top of galvanizing. It seems to have depth and two layers. It's lush, it's glossy, it's gleaming, and it does have a color somewhere between brown and red. It also features exquisite hand-finished hands, aperture for the date, as well as indices, which are lavishly faceted and micrometrically machined by artisans who just create these pieces for Grand Seiko on diamond-tipped milling tools. So this is an extravagant dial inside an extravagant case. All of it 100 meters water resistant. The movement is Grand Seiko manufacturer caliber 9S85 automatic winding, 37 joules, adjusted in 6 positions rather than the chronometer standard of 5. It beats away at 36,000 vibrations per hour, or 10 beats per second like a Zenith El Primero, and it has 55-hour power reserve, which is superb by any standard, but excellent considering the high accuracy 10 beat per second movement. Now, of course, screw down crown and 100 meters water resistant, very similar to the Rolex in that regard. The key difference is there is no compromise to the water resistance in spite of the presence of a display case back. Let's throw the watch on the wrist one more time, zoom out, get a good look at the watch relative to my wrist. So proportionally, you can see this watch is fine for a smaller wrist. I'd recommend for a wrist as small as 13.5 centimeters in circumference because of the titanium. I wanted these two watches to be comparable, but not identical in their spec. And you can see that the Rolex certainly brings something different to the table. First, it's stainless steel. Second, it's 41 millimeters. And third, the timepiece features a lovely white gold Roman numeral dial on a blue sunburst metallic base. So the timepiece is similar in size, at least at face value, 41 being very close to the 40 millimeters 34mm Grand Seiko, but the watch is broader. It has wider shoulders and a more imposing stance on the wrist, which is why I'm going to zoom out even a little bit more to give you a sense of the scale. The watch is slender, however. If 13.8 is the Grand Seiko, 12.1mm thick with a sloped case flank is what you get here. It will slide underneath any dress cuff. The timepiece has, well, broad shoulders. 49.6mm lug-to-lug if you include the solid end links of the bracelet across the wrist. Then it has a span of 51.7. And because the timepiece is designed as a contemporary watch, remember the Datejust 2 came out in 2009 and it served until 2015, it has that 21mm spacing between the lugs that gives it a much broader, more planted, and more contemporary stance on the wrist. It looks like a more modern watch proportionally than the Grand Seiko. The Oyster bracelet is a 3-link design. One might even say it is the 3-link design, and it features a pronounced taper, whereas there's very little discernible taper to the Grand Seiko bracelet. Here there is a neck down from the end link to the clasp. The center links are large and polished. The outer faces are polished. The bracelet is assembled using screws. It's important to note that Grand Seiko's titanium bracelets are assembled using pin sleeves. And then the clasp itself is a substantial component featuring an internal lift lock system. It's effectively a single trigger release that snaps shut. You can't just pull it open. It's not friction fit. You do have to disengage the lifting lock. There's a little bit of adjustability built in here as you have Easy Link, which is a 5mm in or out adjustment equivalent to adding or removing one full-size sizable link. And then you can see there are little divots inside the clasp that allow you to further fine-tune by changing the anchoring point of the bracelet. Jumping around to the case, you can see it is the polar opposite of the Grand Seiko. Rather than being artisanally finished, it's principally of mechanical construction and execution, though it does have a considerably more elegant profile in that it doesn't have the polyhedron form. As a result, it seems beautifully integral. A little bit monolithic, silver, but handsomely compound curved, so it doesn't have the sheer siding or the squared off lugs of the super case of, for example, an Explorer 2, a GMT, a Submariner, or the Sea Dweller. There is an elegance here that's ported over pretty much one for one from the Datejust 36. The watches have the same lithe grace in profile, and that's something, especially with the complexity of the curvature, the Grand Seiko does not have. The bezel is broad and conical, and it gives way to a dial that is simply explosive. As you can see, the dial with polished white gold Roman numerals, white gold hands, white gold 5-point coronet, and then that metallic sunburst base is considerably more reactive than the Grand Seiko dial, which really needs to catch the light at the perfect angle to show its true color. There's less to the Rolex dial in terms of complexity, but it yields all of its secrets relatively quickly in even modest light. It is a graceful and handsome dial, and it wears well in the 41mm case, just as the Cyclops Eye wears with less of a crowding effect than it would have on the 36mm and smaller Rolex models. It's proportional to the dial, and I think 41 is a good size for a Datejust and a contemporary Rolex all-around watch. Also 100 meters water resistant, but this one with no display case back. It has Rolex manufactured caliber 3136, which was only ever used in this watch in this reference. 48-hour power reserve, 31 joules, 28,800 vibration per hour, or 8 beat per second beat rate. Stop seconds, quickset date. It has a free sprung balance with a full bridge architecture for shock resistance. It has an overcoil hairspring that allows it to keep excellent time in any orientation with respect to gravity. It is a handmade Breguet overcoil, and the overcoil itself is made of a blue oxidized niobium zirconium alloy, which Rolex calls parachrom blue, which is highly anti-magnetic, and it's very similar to the alloy used in the hairspring of the old IWC Ingenieur 500,000 ampere per meter. So I suspect this watch in the real world may be just as resilient as a Rolex Milgauss. So that's what you're getting when you get the Rolex Datejust 41. So let's talk about advantages. First, let's talk about the Grand Seiko. We'll review the advantages in the same order that we reviewed the watches. The Grand Seiko simply wears lighter on the wrist in titanium. It's a timepiece that has a wonderful wieldy feel to it, almost effortless, almost toy-like at times, and wonderfully comfortable, especially if you have a smaller wrist or you're sensitive to the weight of your watch. The case finish, the black polish, the hand execution, it's second to none. And by second to none, I mean no high horology manufacturer, no Holy Trinity, no Longa, no boutique independent does a better job of finishing cases, nor is the case generic in any way. Whereas the Datejust has a comfortably generic Rolex form, the 44GS is unlike any other Grand Seiko case form. It's been a specialty of the brand since 1967 in the first 44GS, and it looks like no other company's case, so it is both attractive and unique. I'll also mention that we have unique high heartbeat movement here. 10 beats per second creates a very different look to the sweep of the seconds hand and the sound against the ear, plus the watch has a power reserve advantage of 55 hours versus 48 for the Rolex. The display case back, you get to see that for which you've paid, and it is a good looking watchmaker assembled and watchmaker regulated luxury horology movement. Rarity, exclusivity. Rolex is everywhere, and even though this is by no means a common Datejust variant, there are undoubtedly multiples more of these in the world than there are of these. So if you don't want the watch everyone has, or the brand literally everyone has, you want to go with this watch amongst the two in our test. I'll also mention that there's zero baggage. You have a watch that is effectively a very Grand Seiko. There is an unwanted element to the attention that a Rolex can draw. It could be everything from danger and threat of robbery to simple unwanted questions and gawking. This watch will draw none of that. The person who knows what this is the kind of person you want to buy a beer or a coffee with whom you want to have a chat. And finally, no date magnifier. Can you read that? It says 31. Do you need the Cyclops eye to read the date? I don't, and in my opinion, it's not necessary. It wears better on the bigger Datejust, but none at all is the best possible answer, and Grand Seiko aces the test. Finally, I would mention that this is a watch to buy pre-owned. As pre-owned, they're not available new anymore. They sell for $4,000 to $4,500, so from a value standpoint, it's Grand Seiko. Okay, Rolex. Let's say you do want that history and heritage. There's just a little bit more here than there is with the Grand Seiko brand, which after all shifts its designs often and was only established in 1960. Rolex dates back to 1905, the Datejust back to 1945, and it's important to remember that when you have an iconic model family and an iconic model name, that gives the watch a sort of timeless quality and a transcendent quality. It's a watch that has value and recognition beyond the watch space, and for a lot of folks, especially if you're giving a gift, this is the one to give because it will impress, it will satisfy, and if prestige and status are part of your conception of luxury watch ownership, the recognition factor here is immediate. It's not to my taste, that recognition, status, and stature element of watch owning, but it is part of the hobby, and for some it is important. So on that basis, this watch wins out. This watch is considerably thinner. Here's a more substantive advantage. As you can see, the 13.8mm thick Grand Seiko is burger-like, whereas I would say the Rolex is a bit more of a panini. So elegance and slim profile flow to the Rolex. I'll also mention wrist presence. Cover up the name and you still have a watch that's more imposing on the wrist. 41mm with broader dimensions from lug to lug, link to link, and a wider lug spacing. It simply has a more commanding presence on your forearm. This watch has a far superior bracelet. You can see the taper of the bracelet, which is a lovely, gradual, handsome, well-considered aesthetic choice, whereas the almost completely straight link bracelet of the Grand Seiko appears inelegant, workmanlike, and a bit utilitarian by comparison. The individual links feels far more substantial, and it's not just down to the material being steel here. There is less play laterally between the links, and rather than being fitted with pin sleeves as on the Grand Seiko, the links are fit with screws, making swapping easier, and of course screw fixed links are more expensive to manufacture. And of course you have the adjustability inside the clasp, which feels far more secure and solid than the Grand Seiko clasp. You've got the divots internally and you've got the Easy Link system, so it's a more solid clasp, a more expensive closure mechanism, and then you have more adjustability internally. I'll also mention that this is a safe long-term store of value. The last listed retail for this watch, which passed out of production in 2015, was $7,150. Today these sell with box and papers pre-owned between $7,300 and $7,900 US. So if you want a watch that will hold its value over the long term, largely immune to the ebb and flow of economies and the ebb and flow of tastes and vogue, a Rolex Datejust in any dimension is a great bet to make. I'll also mention that it feels more substantial on the wrist. Think of this as the car door phenomenon. When you slam the door on a Mercedes-Benz versus, for example, a Geo or a Chevrolet Cobalt, you hear a solid thunk and zero resonance. It doesn't shake, it doesn't rattle, there are no secondary motions or sounds. The Rolex on the wrist feels like that door sounds, whereas the Grand Seiko, though beautifully made, does not have that sense of solidity that conveys the quality wrought on this piece. So if you want the watch that feels more luxurious, eyes closed, that's the Rolex. Which one do I want? On the balance of its uniqueness and its subtle beauty, I'm going to opt for the Grand Seiko because I'm that kind of guy. It's a bit counterculture, and I am the ultimate oddball. This is a watch nerd watch, and I'm a watch nerd, so it's my choice. But there are plenty of legitimate reasons that have nothing to do with status backing the Rolex as the winner of this test. So personal preference gives it to the SBGH, but you could just as easily give it to the 116300. Let me know your choice in the comments below.